Hello and welcome to Introduction to Python. Python is a programming language that is derived from C. So we'll be having a look into that. And we'll be using a program of chapters and content that's online. And that's supplied by the Python Institute, which is their Python Essentials course. And we'll be having a look over the fundamentals of computer programming, the differences between compilation and interpretation. We'll have a brief discussion about what Python is. We'll get to doing our first program, which will be just a very simple something printing on the screen, and we'll do that in Python's idle that comes packaged with the Python itself. And as the last course finished off doing C# in Visual Studio, I'll show students how they can load the Python module into Visual Studio if they wish to use that. So the Python Essentials courses, there's basically two of them. They take between 30 and 40 hours each, depending on how fast you read, how fast you do the labs. So each of them has 4 modules, and they will be composed of actual course content and labs online. So the actual presentation of the course online, the screen splits so that you've got a sandbox so you can actually practice bits of code as they explain it. It's quite well done. So within module 1, which is what this video is on, is Introduction to Python and Computer Programming. Module 2 will go through data types, variables, and basic input and output, and the operators. Module 3, Boolean values, loops, lists. Module 4, functions, dictionaries, tuples. So there's quite a good foundation in those 4 modules. And the second Essentials course, there will be the packaging and pip. So we'll go through module 2, exceptions, strings, list methods. Module 3, the object orientating Python. And module 4's miscellaneous items. Now, there's a lot to get through, and take your time. Do the exercises as you come across them. It helps cement all of the activities and the theory together. I mean, it's all information that you need to absorb. Okay, so the 2 courses build up to a certification that you can take, which is P.E.1 3103, which is a Certified Associate in Python Programming. So this is done through a third-party testing center such as Pearson VUE, and if you do well enough within the summary tests, you'll get a lovely little discount of 50% off that exam cost if you're interested. Alright, So let's get into it. What's a language? Well, a language, as you know, is a set of symbols which represent the alphabet for that language. It has a lexis, which is the dictionary, the syntax, which is the rules of how you combine those together, and there's the semantics, which is how you use those rules to make phrases that make sense. Now, a programming language is no different to our human languages as far as those rules are concerned. So, we'll be looking at Python in this series, and we need something to interface with the computers. Okay, computers use a machine language, and Python, if you like, is an intermediate that allows us to translate what we want into machine language that the computers will understand. Now, each of these languages will have a set of commands, which are also known as instruction lists, which is the equivalent to the alphabet within the machine language. So when we write our little language variants in Python, this is a very high level programming language. So it's for us, which is the source code. And the source code is contained within the source file. Now, these names and that may be a little confusing at the moment, but it's important to distinguish the code from the file that contains it. So, there's two ways of translating Python into machine language. We can go the compilation route or the interpretation route. Now, compilation is the ability to create a file that's self-contained. Now, to do this, we need a compiler, and the benefit of doing it this way is it generates a standalone file that can be executed, and you can just send that file around the world. There's no need to have any other tools. The file can run on its own. The interpretation method is where we use something to translate on the fly. Now, this is very good for development because we can adjust the code, we can execute the code, debug the code without having to go through and compile it every time. Downside is when we want to send the product out, the source code needs the interpreter to execute it. So it's not a standalone, but it allows us a lot more flexibility, and we can immediately execute these changes without having to go through the slow process of compiling it to test it. So the interpreter takes the source code in a pure text format. It reads it like a Western style language, left to right, top to bottom, and it will check to make sure the 4 standard elements of a language are met, and determines whether there's any errors within it, and then tries to execute it. Now, what's an interpreter? What's an example? Python's idle and Visual Studio, to just name two. Alright, so the advantages of running it in a interpreted format provides us the flexibility, which is great when we're developing the code. It allows us to test it on the fly, make adjustments, and keep the development going. Disadvantages: everybody needs that interpreter to be able to run the code, and the interpreter takes resources away from the computer because it needs to run as well as the code. So on large programs, that may be detrimental depending on how many resources your machine has. Now, because these go through an interpreter, they've been known as scripting. So, you can get Python referred to as a scripting language and the code as scripts. Now, some history. Python was created by Mr. Rossman, and he was a fan of Monty Python's Flying Circus. So he named this language after his favourite TV show. It is a very widely used language now. It is still under active management. In other words, we'll get updates, new versions. So it's very much a live language and developing language. So the goals for Python as a language was for it to be easy and intuitive, open source so anybody can contribute to its development. It needs to be able to be easy to read in English, suitable for everyday tasks so that it can be used to do just about anything. It is a trustworthy and mature language as far as programming concerns. And if you look at the popularity of programming languages, it's up there. Depending on which one you look at, it's in the top 5. So enjoy. It's quite useful. Now, there is a couple of different versions, and they're not compatible with each other. Python 2 is the older, and it's no longer under active development as a language, but there is still quite a lot of programs out there in that language. It's not necessarily easy to port from version 2 to version 3. So you may come across code in version 2. Current version at this time is version 3, and it's going through its own evolution path. As such, it's not backward compatible. So it's got its own standards. It's still based on a derivative of C, and the basis of the code is still the same. It's just not backward compatible with the environment. Okay, some of the groups that are contributing to the actual development of Python as a language. the Python Software Foundation, which Rossum is actually the president of. So this is the main developer of the language, this foundation. This version is commonly referred to as P.E.1. So there's a few different names floating around for the different sources of Python language. Another one out there is Python. Now, this version of Python code automatically translates it into C, and it's executed in C. So it's a little different in how it goes about things. Another version is Python. Now, this is a Java-based language, not C. So it was built around the Python 2 standards, and it's good for running on Java infrastructure. PyPy is a restricted language, so it's very much a cut down version that feeds on itself. So this one translates into C language and is executed individually. Alright, that's a bit of the history of what's available. So, how do you get it? You can jump straight across to python.org and go to its download section. And if you are a Linux user, you may already have it inbuilt. So to check, just open up a console and type in Python 3. If it comes up with a little listing there with the licensing, copyright information, then you have it inside your operating system already. So what do you need to start coding? Well, you need some form of a text editor such as Notepad++. Alright, you need it to be in plain text. Alright, if you get fancy editors, they use non-standard code for characters, which means it won't translate into Python correctly. So Notepad++ is a good one. It supports multiple languages and does some color coding in that, so it makes it easier to understand where you are within the program. You need a console to launch your code in, and you need some form of debugger. Now, most of our third-party applications that we can use, such as Visual Studio, will be available with these features inbuilt. So select the tools that suit you. As I said, idle comes with Python 3. It's actually a integrated development and learning environment, and you can type Python straight into it and get a result basically instantaneously. Or Visual Studio. Again, I'll go through those later on. So here we have idle. Idle will be found within the Python installation folders, depending on where you put it. So if you're on a Windows 10 machine, just go through your menu and click on it, and it'll open up a little shell like this. To start a new file, same like any Windows-based operating system. So File, New File, and it opens up a little inbuilt text editor, so you can actually input the code. You can then save that code as a source file by going through File, Save As. Just remember to save your file with the .py extension. So in the example here, we created a snake.py, and we're creating a very, very complicated program that's just going to print hiss onto the screen of the console. Save it. You'll notice the little asterisk next to the name indicating that the file has been modified since the last time it was saved. You then press Run in the menu, and it'll drop back into the shell and execute your Python code. Now, if you're just doing straight Python, you can type it into the actual shell, just to give you a little tip. Alright, so parentheses are always in pairs in Python. Alright, you'll get used to doing tabs and parentheses. In other words, brackets. Alright, so that was your first program created. Alright, so installing Python on your machine is very easy. Just download it, execute it, and then open idle, and it's good to go. Now, for my students, we just completed C# and we used Visual Studio in that course. So how do you install the modules for it? Well, when you open the Create New Projects tab, down the bottom is the Install More Tools feature. Click on that, and then that's how you add different languages to Visual Studio. So select Python development. As you can see from this screen, you've got a few different options of development and languages, and select the appropriate features over on the right hand side. You then, after selecting what you want, click down the bottom right hand corner on the Modify tab to install the changes that you've selected. This will take a few minutes depending on your internet connection, and once it's finished installing the packages, you'll get the options to create Python applications when you create projects. Standard function, click on the application, next, name your project, specify the location that the file is being saved, and then click the create button to open up the standard interface. Exactly the same snakepy file, print hiss, and you can see here it'll open up so hit the start or run button up here, and I'll open up a little console and run the code. So for those familiar with Visual Studio, there's no difference in the function of testing your code and debugging your code within the VS environment. Alright, so I think this will be long enough for our first video. So, in summary, we went through the learning material we're going to use is Python Essentials, which is available to anyone. Just jump across to the Python Institute. You can enroll in the course yourself. It's a free course available to anyone. For my students, we'll be using the Python Essential courses via the Cisco Netacad system, because that gives me a unified grade book, so I can have results in one easy location. For non-students, people joining in and looking at these videos, you can go across, as I said, to Python Institute and enroll in the Python Essentials course on their website directly and work your way through the examples and the course. So this one we had a very brief introduction into the fundamentals of the programming. Now, we had a look at the differences between compilation and interpretation, how a language is constructed, the 4 elements. We looked at what Python is, how it came about, and we looked at 2 methods that we can use as interpreters while we learn. So, idle and Visual Studio, and we went through installing and using those. And that will bring us to the conclusion of this first video in this series. Thank you for watching. Until next time, bye for now.